The moon hung like a silver coin above the cobblestones of Oxenfurt, casting long shadows between the merchant stalls that had closed hours ago. Most of the city slept peacefully, but in a modest inn called the Weary Traveler, two figures sat by a dying fire, their conversation barely above a whisper. Tonight, we begin with a tale that unfolds not in the chaos of battle or the heat of adventure, but in the quiet moments that exist between heartbeats. A story where the greatest magic isn't found in spells or potions, but in the simple act of two souls finding solace in each other's presence. Before we settle into this gentle tale, take a moment to like this video if stories help you find peace at the end of long days. Let me know in the comments what time it is, where you're listening, and whether you prefer tales of adventure or quiet moments like this one. It's always wonderful to know who's joining us for these peaceful journeys into sleep. This isn't a story of grand quests or world-ending threats. Tonight, we follow Geralt of Rivia and Yennefer of Vengerberg as they discover that sometimes the most profound adventures happen when you're simply sitting still. Our tale takes place during a rare moment of calm in their otherwise turbulent lives. A brief respite where destiny allows them to simply be together without the weight of the world pressing down on their shoulders. The fire crackled softly as Geralt adjusted the worn leather of his travel pack, methodically checking his potions and oils with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades on the road. Across from him, Yennefer sat with an ancient tome, balanced on her knees, her violet eyes scanning pages that seemed to shimmer in the firelight. The inn around them had settled into that comfortable quiet that comes after midnight, when even the most persistent tavern songs have faded and the world belongs only to dreamers and insomniacs. They'd been traveling together for nearly a fortnight now, following leads about a missing merchant's daughter that had brought them through 3 kingdoms and countless small villages. It was the kind of mundane contract that Geralt usually handled alone, but circumstances had aligned to bring Yennefer along, and neither had questioned the arrangement too closely. Some things, they'd learned, were better left unexamined. The sorceress closed her book with a soft thud and looked across the space between them. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was thinking about things that existed beyond the practical concerns of their daily survival. To have a life that doesn't revolve around other people's problems. Geralt's hands paused in their methodical work. He'd been wondering the same thing, though he'd never quite found the words to voice it. Sometimes, he admitted, setting aside a vial of swallow and meeting her gaze. "Though, I'm not sure I'd know what to do with that kind of peace." She smiled at that, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and made her look younger than her years. "I think that's the point. We wouldn't have to do anything at all." She gestured toward the window, where moonlight painted silver squares on the wooden floor. "We could watch the seasons change, learn the names of flowers, argue about whether the bread at the morning market is better than the bread at the evening market." The Witcher found himself imagining such a life, and the image came easier than he'd expected. A small house, perhaps, with a garden that Yennefer would insist on enchanting to grow impossible combinations of herbs and flowers. A place where his swords could hang on the wall as decoration rather than necessity, where the sound of approaching footsteps wouldn't automatically make him reach for a weapon. "You'd be bored within a month," he said, but his tone was gentle, almost fond. "Probably," she agreed, though she didn't sound particularly concerned about it. But it might be worth trying, don't you think? Just to see what kind of people we'd become if we weren't always running toward danger or away from it. The fire shifted, sending new patterns of light and shadow across their faces. Outside, a night bird called once and then fell silent, as if even it understood the sacred nature of quiet conversations held in the small hours of the morning. Geralt found himself studying Yennefer's face in the firelight, noting the way her expression had softened, how the usual sharp edges of her features seemed to blur into something more vulnerable. "There's an old watchtower," he found himself saying, though he hadn't planned to share this particular memory. "About a day's ride north of Kaer Morhen. It's been abandoned for decades, but the structure is sound. There's a view of the valley that's—" He paused, searching for words that could capture what he'd felt during those rare moments when he'd climbed to the top of that tower. "It's peaceful." Yennefer leaned forward slightly, interested. "You've been there recently." "Last winter, I was tracking a pack of wolves that had been troubling some farmers. Found myself staying an extra day just to watch the snow fall." He shook his head, as if surprised by his own admission. "I kept thinking it would be a good place to read. Quiet enough to hear yourself think. High enough to see trouble coming from miles away," she added, and he realized she understood exactly why that particular detail would appeal to him. Even in his fantasies of peace, the Witcher in him couldn't quite let go of the need to be prepared. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own version of this imagined life. The fire continued to burn low, and gradually the space between them seemed to shrink, as if the inn itself was encouraging them to move closer together. Neither acknowledged the shift, but both felt it, the way the air seems to change before a gentle rain. Yennefer was the first to move, setting her book aside and rising gracefully from her chair. For a moment, Geralt thought she might retreat to her room upstairs, ending this unexpected moment of vulnerability. Instead, she moved to the window and looked out at the moonlit street below. "I used to imagine having a different life," she said quietly, her breath fogging the glass slightly. "Before Aretuza, before I learned what magic could cost. I used to think I'd live in a cottage by the sea and spend my days collecting shells and learning the patterns of the tides." Aenys and Geralt joined her at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lilac and gooseberries that always seemed to cling to her hair. "What changed your mind?" She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I realized that some dreams are too small for the people we become. But lately," she turned to look at him, and in her eyes, he saw something he'd rarely glimpsed there before. Not the fierce determination that drove her through battles, not the sharp intelligence that made her such a formidable sorceress, but something softer and more fragile. "Lately, I think maybe small dreams aren't such a terrible thing after all." The moonlight caught in her dark hair, and for a moment, Geralt found himself thinking that this was what contentment might look like. Not the wild joy of victory or the fierce satisfaction of a contract completed, but this quiet sense of rightness, of being exactly where he was supposed to be with exactly the right person. "We could try it," he heard himself saying. "After this contract is finished, we could ride north, see that watchtower. It's not quite a cottage by the sea, but there are streams nearby, the sound of running water, pine trees that whisper when the wind blows through them." Yennefer's smile was soft and genuine. "Are you asking me to run away with you, Geralt of Rivia? I'm asking you to run towards something instead of away from it," he replied. "There's a difference." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, in a gesture that was both intimate and comforting. Her skin was warm despite the cool night air, and he found himself marveling at how natural this felt, how right it seemed to stand here with her in this quiet moment between one day and the next. "Tell me more about this watchtower," she said, settling back into her chair and pulling him gently down beside her. "Tell me everything you remember about it." And so he did, describing the way the morning mist clung to the valley floor, the ancient stones worn smooth by centuries of weather, the small garden that had somehow survived decades of neglect and still bloomed with wild roses each spring. As he spoke, Yennefer closed her eyes and listened, and gradually her breathing became slower and deeper, matching the rhythm of his words. The fire burned lower still, but neither of them moved to add more wood. The warmth between them seemed sufficient, a gentle heat that had nothing to do with flames and everything to do with the simple comfort of shared dreams and quiet understanding. When Yennefer's breathing finally settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, Geralt found himself reluctant to move. Her head had come to rest against his shoulder sometime during his description of the wild flowers that grew along the watchtower's crumbling walls. And now she slept with the peaceful expression of someone who had finally set down a burden she'd been carrying too long. The Witcher remained perfectly still, watching the dying embers cast shifting patterns across her face. He'd seen her sleep before, of course, during their travels and shared camps, but those had been the guarded rest of a sorceress always ready to wake at the first sign of danger. This was different. This was the sleep of someone who felt safe, and Geralt found that realization more moving than any magic he'd ever witnessed. The inn around them had grown even quieter, if such a thing were possible. Even the creaking of old wooden beams seemed muted, as if the building itself respected the sanctity of these peaceful hours. Through the window, he could see that the moon had traveled further across the sky, though dawn was still hours away. Time moved differently in moments like this, stretching and condensing like honey poured from a jar. Carefully, so as not to disturb her, Geralt reached for the blanket draped over the back of his chair and settled it gently around Yennefer's shoulders. She stirred slightly at the touch of the wool, murmuring something in the ancient language of magic that might have been a blessing or simply the remnants of a dream. Her fingers tightened briefly around his hand before relaxing again, and he took that as permission to stay. The Witcher had spent most of his long life in motion, always traveling from one contract to the next, always alert for the next threat or opportunity. Stillness had been a luxury he could rarely afford, and when he did allow himself to rest, it was with one ear always listening for approaching footsteps or the distant howl of something that might require his attention. But here, in this unremarkable inn, in an unremarkable town, he felt something he'd almost forgotten was possible. He felt at home. It wasn't the building that created this sense of belonging, of course. The weary traveler was pleasant enough, but it was just another inn among hundreds he'd stayed in over the years. The feeling came from the woman sleeping against his shoulder, from the quiet conversation they'd shared, from the dreams they'd dared to speak aloud in the safety of midnight's embrace. Geralt found himself thinking about the watchtower again, but now his mental image of it included details he'd never considered before. Yennefer's books arranged on rough-hewn shelves, their leather bindings worn soft with use. A garden where practical herbs grew alongside flowers chosen purely for their beauty. 2 chairs by a window where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the valley below. The fantasy felt dangerously real, as if it were a memory borrowed from a future that might actually come to pass. He could imagine waking up in that tower, not to the sound of alarm bells or cries for help, but to the gentle sounds of birds greeting the morning. He could picture Yennefer humming as she prepared breakfast, her magic used not for battle, but for the simple pleasure of warming bread or keeping coffee at the perfect temperature. A log in the fireplace shifted, sending up a small shower of sparks, and the sound brought Geralt back to the present moment. Yennefer's breathing remained steady and deep, undisturbed by the minor commotion. Her face in sleep looked younger, more vulnerable, and he found himself studying the delicate lines around her eyes, the way her dark lashes cast shadows on her cheeks. He'd memorized her face a dozen times over the years, but always in contexts of urgency or passion. This quiet observation felt different, more intimate somehow than their most heated encounters. There was something profound about watching someone sleep, about being trusted with their defenselessness. It was a gift he hadn't expected to receive, and one he found himself treasuring more than gold or glory. The night sounds of the city filtered through the window in gentle waves. A cat picking its way across distant rooftops, the soft splash of something small jumping into the canal that ran behind the inn, the whisper of wind moving through empty market stalls. These were the sounds of a world at peace, a world where the greatest excitement might be the arrival of a merchant caravan or the announcement of a harvest festival. Geralt tried to imagine himself as part of such a world, and the image came easier than it once had, perhaps because he was no longer trying to picture himself alone in such a life. The solitary cottage in the woods had always felt like a pleasant impossibility, but a home shared with someone who understood both his silences and his stories felt suddenly, startlingly achievable. He thought about the contracts that had brought them here, the missing merchant's daughter they would continue searching for when morning came. In a few hours, they would return to their roles as witcher and sorceress, professionals bound by duty and expertise to solve other people's problems. But right now, in this suspended moment between sleep and waking, they were simply Geralt and Yennefer, 2 people who had found something precious in each other's company. The fire had burned down to glowing coals now, casting everything in a warm amber light that made the humble inn feel like a palace. Yennefer shifted slightly in her sleep, turning her face more fully into his shoulder, and Geralt caught the faint scent of the lavender soap she'd used earlier. Such a simple thing, but it spoke of small luxuries and moments of self-care, stolen between battles and betrayals. He found himself wondering what other small pleasures they might discover together, if given the chance. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, the satisfaction of a garden well tended, long conversations about books and philosophy that didn't need to serve any purpose beyond the joy of thinking together, the luxury of arguments about trivial things, the kind of domestic disputes that only people with time and security could afford to have. Outside, a church bell chimed the hour, though Geralt couldn't tell if it was marking 2 in the morning or 3. Time had lost its usual meaning, compressed into this perfect bubble of peace where nothing existed except the warmth of shared presence and the gentle rhythm of Yennefer's breathing. He could feel his own eyes growing heavy, the exhaustion of long travel finally catching up with him, now that he felt safe enough to acknowledge it. But he didn't want to sleep. Not yet. These moments were too precious to waste in unconsciousness, too rare to surrender without savoring them fully. How many times in his long life had he experienced this particular combination of comfort and contentment? Not many, he realized. Perhaps not ever before, not like this. The realization should have frightened him. This acknowledgement of how much this meant, how much she meant. Instead, it felt like a weight lifting from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For so long, he'd believed that caring too much was a liability, that attachment made you vulnerable in ways that could prove fatal. But sitting here with Yennefer sleeping peacefully against him, he understood that some vulnerabilities were worth the risk. A gentle snore escaped her, barely audible, but utterly endearing, and Geralt found himself smiling in the darkness. Even in sleep, she was distinctly herself, powerful and delicate, fierce and gentle, all the contradictions that made her who she was. He wondered what she was dreaming about, whether her sleeping mind had carried her to that cottage by the sea she'd mentioned, or perhaps to the watchtower he'd described, where wildflowers grew in defiance of abandonment and time. The coals in the fireplace pulsed with their own gentle rhythm, like a sleeping heartbeat, and gradually Geralt felt his own pulse slow to match it. His eyelids grew heavy, despite his desire to remain awake, to guard this perfect moment against the inevitable return of mourning and responsibility. But perhaps there was wisdom in letting sleep come, in trusting that some things were worth preserving in the realm of dreams, where they could remain untouched by the harsh realities of the waking world. As consciousness began to fade around the edges, Geralt's last coherent thought was that he would remember this night, this feeling of absolute rightness, no matter what tomorrow might bring. Some memories, he knew, were strong enough to sustain you through any darkness that followed. His dreams, when they finally came, were unusually vivid and strangely peaceful. Instead of the nightmares that usually plagued his sleep, filled with monsters and memories of battles long past, Geralt found himself walking through sunlit meadows, where the grass grew tall and soft beneath his feet. In this dream landscape, there were no contracts waiting, no desperate villagers pleading for help, no monsters lurking in shadowed corners. The watchtower, from his waking thoughts, stood at the center of this dreamscape, but it had been transformed. No longer the crumbling ruin he remembered, it rose from the hillside, like something from a fairy tale, its stones warm and golden in the afternoon light. Flowers cascaded from window boxes he'd never seen before, and the sound of laughter drifted down from somewhere high above. Yennefer was there, of course, though in the fluid way of dreams, she seemed to exist in multiple places at once. Sometimes she stood at the tower's highest window, her hair caught in a breeze that smelled of sea salt and wild roses. Other times, she walked beside him through the meadow, her hand in his, pointing out constellations of wildflowers that spelled out words in languages that existed only in sleep. The dream version of her wore simple clothes, a white dress that moved like water around her ankles, and her feet were bare against the grass. She looked younger, or perhaps it was just that the weight of centuries of magical study and political maneuvering had been lifted from her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice carried the same intelligence and wit he knew so well. But there was something else there too, a lightness, as if she'd finally learned to laugh at herself without cruelty. They climbed the tower together, though the stairs seemed to multiply as they ascended, each level revealing new rooms filled with impossible things. A library where the books read themselves aloud, their pages turning with whispered words. A workshop where potions brewed themselves while humming gentle melodies. A kitchen where bread rose without kneading and soup stirred itself while they talked about everything and nothing. At the very top, they found a room that was somehow both inside and outside, with walls that opened onto endless vistas of rolling hills and distant mountains. The furniture was simple but comfortable. Chairs that molded themselves to fit perfectly. A bed piled high, with quilts that smelled like lavender and home. Through windows that couldn't possibly exist in the real tower, they could see all the seasons at once. Spring rain falling on summer gardens, autumn leaves drifting past winter snow, all of it harmonious and right. In the dream, they had all the time in the world. No urgent messages arriving with dawn. No desperate faces at the inn door begging for help. They could spend hours discussing the books that lined the impossible shelves, or sit in comfortable silence, watching the ever-changing view. Sometimes they would work together in the garden that existed on every level of the tower simultaneously. Yennefer coaxing impossible blooms from ordinary seeds, while Geralt learned the names of plants that had nothing to do with alchemy or healing. The dream Yennefer would catch his hand as he reached for a particularly stubborn weed, shaking her head with a smile. "Let it grow," she would say. "Not everything needs to be useful. Some things can simply be beautiful." And he would nod, understanding that she was talking about more than just wildflowers. In this dreamed life, they were allowed to exist without purpose, beyond their own happiness. They could be beautiful without being useful, could love without it serving some greater destiny or darker fate. As the dream continued, Geralt found himself experiencing emotions with a clarity that felt foreign to his waking self. Joy without reservation, peace without vigilance, love without the constant fear of loss that shadowed his real-world relationships. Here, in this impossible tower, he could touch Yennefer's face without wondering when duty would call them apart. He could make plans for tomorrow without calculating the odds that they'd both survive to see it. The Dream Tower seemed to understand their need for both solitude and connection. When they wanted to be alone, rooms would appear that were perfectly suited to individual pursuits. When they sought each other's company, the walls would dissolve, creating spaces that drew them naturally together. It was architecture that responded to the heart rather than the hand, magic that served comfort rather than conquest. In one particularly vivid sequence, they sat together on a balcony that jutted out into empty air, suspended impossibly above the valley floor. The sun was setting and rising simultaneously in different parts of the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and rose. Yennefer leaned against his shoulder, just as she did in the waking world. But here, there was no weight of weariness in the gesture, only the simple pleasure of contact. "Do you think we could really do this?" the dream Yennefer asked, though her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Leave it all behind and just exist?" Sis's dream Geralt found he had no doubt, no carefully considered reservations about the practicalities of such a life. "We're already doing it," he replied, and in the context of the dream, this made perfect sense. They had already chosen each other, already found their way to this place of peace. The only question was whether they would remember when they woke. The dream began to shift then, as dreams do when consciousness starts to reassert itself. The tower remained solid, But the impossible rooms began to fold in on themselves, becoming more like memories than experiences. The endless vista outside the windows compressed into a single view. Beautiful, but finite. The sensation of flying became the more mundane feeling of sitting in a chair by a dying fire. But even as the dream faded, its emotional truth remained. The feeling of absolute safety, of being known and accepted completely, lingered like the scent of flowers after the garden has been left behind. When Geralt's eyes finally opened to the gray light of early dawn, he found that the piece of his dreamed watchtower hadn't entirely disappeared. It lived now somewhere behind his ribs, a warm certainty that such happiness was possible, that it might even be within reach. The fire had died to cold ashes during the night, but the inn remained warm, heated by the presence of other sleeping guests and the general coziness of thick walls and heavy curtains. Yennefer still slept against his shoulder, though sometime during the night she had shifted to curl more fully against his side, one hand resting on his chest. Her breathing remained deep and even, undisturbed by his gentle awakening. Geralt allowed himself a few more minutes of stillness, studying her face in the pale morning light that filtered through the window. Sleep had erased the lines of concentration that usually marked her features, leaving behind something softer and more vulnerable. He could see traces of the young woman she must have been before magic and politics hardened her into the formidable sorceress the world knew. The realization that he was perhaps the only person alive who was trusted to see this version of her filled him with a tenderness that was almost overwhelming. The sounds of the inn waking up began to filter through the walls. Footsteps in the hallway above, the distant clatter of pots in the kitchen, the soft murmur of early rising guests making their way downstairs for breakfast. Soon, this peaceful interlude would end, and they would return to being Geralt of Rivia and Yennefer of Vengerberg, professionals with a job to complete. But for now, in these last moments before the world intruded, they were still just themselves, still wrapped in the quiet magic of shared rest and dreamed possibilities. Yennefer stirred slightly, her fingers tightening briefly against his chest before relaxing again. Her breathing changed, becoming less deep, and Geralt knew she was beginning the slow journey back to consciousness. He found himself hoping that her dreams had been as peaceful as his own, that she had found her own version of that impossible watchtower, where love was simple and time was infinite. When her eyes finally opened, they were soft with sleep and something else, a contentment that transformed her usual sharp awareness into something gentler. She didn't immediately pull away or apologize for falling asleep against him. Instead, she remained still for a long moment, as if she too was reluctant to break the spell of this quiet morning. "Good morning," she said finally, her voice husky with sleep, but warm with something that might have been happiness. "Good morning," he replied, and found that the simple exchange felt like a promise, though of what, he couldn't quite say. She stretched carefully, working out the stiffness of sleeping in a chair, but she didn't move away from him entirely. Her hand remained on his chest, a point of contact that seemed to anchor them both to this moment of peace. "I dreamed of towers," she said quietly, as if the admission were a secret worth sharing. "So did I," Geralt replied, and the coincidence felt less like chance than like inevitability. Of course, they had dreamed the same dreams. Of course, their sleeping minds had found their way to the same imagined refuge. They sat in comfortable silence, as the inn continued to wake around them, neither ready to break the spell entirely. Through the window, Geralt could see merchants beginning to set up their stalls in the market square, the ordinary business of the world resuming after the night's pause. Soon, they would need to join that world to remember their purpose and continue their search for the missing merchant's daughter. But not quite yet. The morning light grew stronger, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that reminded Geralt of his dream. Yennefer's hair caught the light, and for a moment, she looked exactly as she had in the impossible tower, beautiful and at peace, and utterly herself. The image was so vivid that he almost expected to see wildflowers blooming in the corners of the inn, to hear the sound of wind through pine trees instead of the bustle of a waking city. "We should probably get some real sleep," Yennefer said eventually, though she made no move to get up. "In actual beds, I mean. We have a long day ahead of us." Geralt nodded, knowing she was right, but reluctant to agree too quickly. Once they separated, once they returned to their individual rooms and their professional roles, this moment would become just a memory. Not a bad thing, necessarily. Some memories were worth more than the experiences that created them. But still, it felt like a small loss. "The watchtower," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the words. "When this contract is finished, the offer stands." Yennefer smiled, and it was the same smile from his dreams, full of possibility and quiet joy. "I know," she said. "I'm counting on it." And with that promise hanging in the air between them, like incense, like magic, like hope itself, they finally rose from their chairs and prepared to face whatever the day might bring, carrying with them the memory of peace and the dream of towers where love could grow wild and untended, beautiful for its own sake. The merchant's daughter they sought was named Alara, and her trail had grown cold 3 days past in the village of Millhaven. The innkeeper there had spoken of a young woman matching her description, traveling with a group of performers who claimed to be bound for the spring festivals in Novigrad. But the performers had vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving behind only rumors and the faint scent of exotic spices that didn't belong to any caravan the villagers recognized. Yennefer had used her magic to trace the residual energy of teleportation, the telltale shimmer that lingered when someone with power moved through space without walking. The trail led north and east toward the borderlands, where kingdoms blurred together and laws became suggestions rather than absolutes. It was exactly the sort of place where a merchant's daughter might disappear forever, sold to slavers, or worse, her fate becoming another cautionary tale whispered in taverns. But as they rode through the morning mist, following roads that seemed to dissolve at the edges like watercolors in rain, Geralt found his attention divided between the hunt and the woman riding beside him. Yennefer sat her horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, though he knew she'd learned to ride the same way she'd learned everything else, through determination and practice rather than natural gift. Her dark hair was braided practically for travel, but the morning light caught in the loose strands that had escaped, creating a halo effect that reminded him of his dreams. They'd spoken little since leaving the inn, but the silence between them felt different now. Not the comfortable quiet of long companionship, but something charged with possibility, weighted with unspoken acknowledgments of what had passed between them in those small hours by the dying fire. Every glance felt significant, every casual touch as they'd prepared their horses, seemed to carry the memory of her sleeping against his shoulder. The countryside through which they traveled was awakening to spring, though winter still clung to the shadows of deep woods and northern slopes. Wildflowers dotted the meadows they passed, the same ones Geralt had dreamed of, and he found himself cataloging their names with an attention that would have seemed foolish just days before. Yennefer noticed his distraction and followed his gaze to a patch of yellow blooms that nodded in the gentle breeze. "Butterbells," she said quietly, and he realized she was teaching him, offering knowledge that had nothing to do with their current mission. They're among the first to bloom each year. In some places, they're considered a sign of good fortune. Geralt filed the information away, alongside dozens of other small details he'd been collecting, without conscious thought. The way she hummed under her breath when she thought no one was listening. How she always checked the sky for weather signs before mounting her horse. The particular expression she wore when she was thinking about something that pleased her, but that she wasn't ready to share. These observations felt different from his usual habit of studying people for weaknesses or tells that might prove useful in negotiations or combat. This was the attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, who found joy in the small mysteries of another person's character. It was, he realized, the way someone in love learned to see the world through another's eyes. The thought should have alarmed him, but instead it settled in his chest like a warm stone, solid and comforting. He'd spent so much of his life fighting against feeling too much, believing that emotional distance was necessary for survival. But riding through the spring morning with Yennefer beside him, he began to wonder if the opposite might be true. Perhaps allowing himself to care completely was not a weakness, but a different kind of strength. They stopped to rest the horses near a stream that chattered its way down from the hills, its water clear enough to drink and cold enough to make them gasp. Yennefer knelt by the bank and cupped the water in her hands, drinking deeply before splashing some on her face and neck. The gesture was unconsciously sensual, and Geralt found himself watching the droplets catch the light as they traced paths down her throat. "The trail is getting stronger," she said, straightening and wiping her hands on her traveling clothes. "Whatever magic was used to transport the girl, it's recent enough that I should be able to track it to its source. Another day's ride, perhaps 2 at most." Geralt nodded, though part of him felt an unexpected reluctance at the thought of their journey ending so soon. Once they found Elara, once they'd completed their contract and seen her safely returned to her father, there would be no reason to continue traveling together. Their paths would diverge, as they always did, drawn apart by different contracts and different obligations, unless, of course, they chose otherwise. "There's something else," Yennefer continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when she'd discovered something that didn't quite fit her expectations. "The magic I'm following. It's not just teleportation. There are traces of something more complex, something that feels almost like..." She paused, frowning as she searched for the right words. Geralt waited patiently, knowing that when Yennefer struggled to describe magic, it usually meant they were dealing with something unusual, possibly dangerous. "Transformation magic," she said finally. "The kind used to change appearances, to make someone look like someone else entirely. But it's subtle, sophisticated, not the crude shape-shifting of Dopplers or were-creatures. This is the work of someone with real skill. The implications settle between them like stones dropped into still water. If Elara had been disguised, If her appearance had been altered by magic, then they might have been following the wrong trail entirely. The young woman the innkeeper had seen might not have been their missing merchant's daughter at all, but someone else entirely, transformed to look like her, for reasons they couldn't yet fathom. A decoy, Geralt said, understanding immediately. Someone wanted us to follow this trail, wanted us to believe Ilara went north with the performers. Yennefer nodded grimly, which means she's probably somewhere else entirely, and we've been led deliberately astray. She was quiet for a moment, considering the possibilities. The question is whether this was planned by whoever took her, or if there's a third party involved, someone with their own interest in keeping Ilara hidden. The complexity of the situation was becoming apparent. Layers of deception and misdirection that spoke of careful planning rather than opportunistic crime. Merchants' daughters didn't usually warrant such elaborate schemes unless there was something more valuable about them than their father's gold. Family connections, perhaps, or knowledge they possessed without realizing its importance. They mounted their horses again and continued north. But now, their journey had a different character. Instead of following a trail, they were pursuing a mystery, trying to unravel a web of lies and magical misdirection that someone had gone to considerable trouble to weave. It was exactly the sort of complex puzzle that both of them excelled at solving, requiring the combination of Geralt's practical experience and Yennefer's magical expertise. As they rode, they began to discuss possibilities, their conversation taking on the familiar rhythm of professional collaboration. But underneath the practical considerations ran an undercurrent of something else, an awareness of each other that had nothing to do with their shared mission. Geralt found himself noticing the way Yennefer's eyes lit up when she worked through a particularly complex magical problem, how her voice took on a different quality when she was thinking aloud, trusting him to follow her reasoning, even when it ventured into areas where he had no expertise. The afternoon sun climbed higher, warming the air and bringing out the sense of new grass and early flowers. They passed through a village so small it barely deserved the name. Just a handful of houses clustered around a well. But the people they met were friendly enough, offering directions and gossip in equal measure. An old woman selling eggs from a basket mentioned seeing a group of performers pass through several days ago, confirming that at least part of their information had been accurate. But when Yennefer quietly cast a small divination spell, using a few coins from her purse as a focus, the magic revealed something troubling. The performers had indeed passed this way, but they'd been traveling alone. No young woman had accompanied them, disguised or otherwise. Whatever trail they'd been following from Millhaven had been a complete fabrication. "We need to go back," Yennefer said as they sat in the shade of an ancient oak tree, sharing bread and cheese they'd bought from the egg seller. "Start over from the beginning. Look for traces we might have missed the first time." Geralt agreed, though the prospect of retracing their steps felt like failure. They'd lost precious time following false leads, and with each passing day, the real trail grew colder. But there was something else troubling him, a nagging sense that they were missing something obvious, some connection that would make sense of the elaborate deception they'd uncovered. "The merchant," he said suddenly, the thought coming to him as he watched Yennefer use a small flame spell to warm their tea. What do we actually know about him, beyond the fact that his daughter is missing? Yennefer paused, considering the question. They'd met with the man briefly, taken his gold and his description of his daughter, but they hadn't really investigated his background or his business dealings. Most missing person cases were straightforward enough. that such details didn't matter. But this was clearly not a typical case. "He deals in spices and rare goods from the south," she said slowly, working through what they knew. "He has trade connections in several kingdoms, enough wealth to hire a witcher and a sorceress to find his daughter." But there was something about him, something that didn't quite ring true. Geralt nodded, remembering his own impression of the man. Too calm for a father whose child was missing, too quick with details that should have been painful to recount. At the time, he'd attributed it to shock or to the emotional numbness that sometimes followed trauma. But now he wondered if there had been a more calculating reason for the man's composure. "We need to learn more about his business," Yennefer said, coming to the same conclusion. "Who his competitors are, what kind of goods he really trades in, whether there's anyone who might benefit from his daughter's disappearance." It was a logical next step, but it would require them to return not just to Millhaven, but all the way back to Oxenfurt, where the merchant maintained his primary residence and warehouse. The journey would take them several days, even if they pushed hard, and Geralt found himself surprised by how little the prospect bothered him. More time on the road with Yennefer, more evenings by campfires or in roadside inns, more opportunities for the kind of quiet conversation that had led to their peaceful night in The Weary Traveler. As if reading his thoughts, Yennefer smiled, the expression transforming her face from its usual mask of professional competence into something warmer and more personal. "It seems we'll be traveling together a while longer," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she found the prospect as appealing as he did. They finished their simple meal and prepared to mount their horses again. But before they could leave, a commotion from the direction of the village drew their attention. Shouts and the sound of running feet, the kind of urgent noise that usually meant trouble of one sort or another. Geralt's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, while Yennefer began gathering the magical energy she'd need if the situation called for more than steel. And so their story continues, winding through mysteries yet unsolved, and paths yet untraveled. Like all the best tales, this one doesn't end with the dying of embers or the breaking of dawn, but lives on in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the promise of towers built for two, and dreams shared in the safety of midnight hours. May your own rest be as peaceful as theirs, and may you wake to find that some dreams, like love itself, are worth the journey.